Today I went to a really amazing conference, and it was called the Perth Property Prophecy, which was an expert market analysis and insights for the WA market. And I've got some really interesting stuff to share with you. Now, the first thing was that investor loans are making up 29% of loans, of new loans, which I thought was a great stat for you all to know. Currently, Perth has a 1.1% rental market vacancy rate, and a balanced market sits at about 3%, so we're still sitting very low with that. Sales have gone from selling within 2 weeks, where before COVID it was 2 months, and rental properties are taking 2 weeks to lease versus 6 weeks pre-COVID, so some other great stats. WA grew 1.1% in population last year, which is a massive influx. And what is also interesting, and it's a bit of a theory that I've got, that not only have we had that population increase, we also find that we've got families that are separating and people that no longer live together needing 2 homes. So all of these things are contributing to a very strong rental market. Now, we had a few speakers on the panel, and they are all very encouraging of the Perth rental market, and pretty much suggesting don't read everything that you see in the media, that it is a strong market. We have a very high, intentions that it's a fantastic market to still buy in, and we're expecting it to continue to be very, very strong. So keep watching, because I've got a little snippet of the panel that were talking about the rental market, including our CEO from REWA, Kath Hart, as well. So I hope you find the questions and the information that they talked about really encouraging, and feel free to leave a comment when you've watched it.
So what we hear is that, and I think you're right, David, like there's a group of people who've invested in Perth property markets, you know, over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, who haven't had a great experience and who are now just seeing those values come back up to kind of where they got in. They're taking advantage of those conditions and going, I'm probably never coming back here again, I'd suggest. And we're certainly hearing lots and lots of people where investors are selling. It is to owner occupiers, it's not to other investors. The data we have is that there are more investors than there have been, but that the Perth market is relatively undervalued, and that we would have expected that figure would be higher. You know, I think about, you know, we've still obviously got the foreign buyers surcharge. You know, I do think that there's a kind of question for policymakers around how we encourage more investors into the Western Australian market, because, you know, the state government can't get their social housing stock out of the ground fast enough to cope with the demands across the housing continuum. Any additional stock that we put in helps that. You know, I'm kind of, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but, you know, stamp duty reform, particularly for seniors who are rattling around in houses that are no longer fit for purpose, stuff like that. Like, as an asset class, it is incredibly underutilised. It's incredibly inefficient how we manage the housing stock, you know, in Australia, but particularly in this state.
I think it's a real challenge in Western Australia. We're seeing a lot of discussion about social housing and a lot of focus on social housing, and that's incredibly important. It's been underinvested on for a very long period of time. But aren't we seeing enough discussion about the housing continuum? How can we increase total stock? How can we get the vacancy rate up and stop rents escalating at the rate that we are at the moment? Not really.
Can I say something back on the last question, supply?
Of course.
That might be interesting. If you talk to the Department of Planning or read their documents, correct me if I'm wrong, they're saying around about 40 years of, yeah, I know that's, but even if you take that number and that's not in the projects, that can only deliver 360 future land projects, which would normally come into the market over a 12-year period. So if you assume that the Department of Planning's headline number is totally market ready, can be taken to market, which obviously it's not, it's 370 projects, future projects, and 12 years of competition. Now, if only 50% of that future supply is actually usable, then you've got around about 6 years before you have a drop in competition. So looking at the supply in terms of how many projects it can yield, it gives you a very short timeline.
Very interesting point. Moving to regional areas, been a couple of questions around regional land and regional housing. Generally undersupplied and generally not a lot of demand, and certainly not a great deal of interest. Do any of you see anything really changing happening in that space?
Nationally, there was a big shift for the regional markets. Geelong was the poster child, I think. It's in Ballarat is another one which saw land volumes double. The Lower Hunter is demonstrating sustained high-level activity, though Sydney Metro is going down because of affordability and supply. And the Sunshine Coast is also demonstrating resilience. So the question is, has the mind shift of the customer towards regional and markets going to remain solid over the forecast period?
And I think the challenge over here is that when we're talking about regional markets, what we're really talking about is the housing crisis that's happening in the northwest of Western Australia. And is anything going to dramatically change there? The government have tried to increase land supply in a lot of those areas. It's incredibly expensive to build, and as investors who got in at the high point have found out, they're highly cyclical markets. I think investors have been incredibly scared of the cities in the northwest, and it's going to be incredibly hard to get them back, and it's still incredibly hard to build up there. So do I see that situation changing? No, I think it's going to take more government intervention, and it's going to continue to be a real sore spot for us, and that towns like Headland and things trying to have housing supply there at the right measure, the right volumes at the right time, it's going to be a continual challenge for us.
So you would say that remains almost a government responsibility driven kind of thing to provide housing supply in those sort of
it's a market failure up there, but it's for highly cyclical markets, and it's a market failure, so yes, it needs government intervention to try and stabilise those sort of markets.
And it's very tricky. The problems of the regional housing markets are problems of labour, right? So, you know, in terms of, you know, we used to talk about land, labour and lumber as the key kind of challenges through COVID, and, you know, apparently timber is improving, but the others still certainly remain very vexed, and much more so in those regional areas. For example, I know the state government, you know, their social housing stock up there, they kind of couldn't accommodate a workforce to do the maintenance to make those dwellings habitable, because there was nowhere for that workforce to stay whilst they were there. So, you know, it's a really vexed problem. But I suspect that there's been people sitting on stages like this in Western Australia probably for the last 40 years saying exactly the same thing. And, you know, like I think there's probably, you know, some more bigger picture thinking for policymakers around how we begin to see through those cycles during the downtime, so that we are ready for when the economy booms again, because it does seem to kind of, you know, it has a very well established pattern.
Final question, because Tanya is circling. In fairly rapid fire, just be interested from each of the panellists' perspective for the Perth market. What are the areas that will be hot, both sort of geographically and product-wise in each of your segments, and what are the areas to avoid?
Northeast, southwest corridors, number one corridors. Good price growth in the northeast. So, and then I think the northwest is now entering a more mature phase. So I think it's setting itself up to being a number one corridor over the next, say, 10 years.
Anything in product?
Product, you've got in terms of land products, we're a bit stuck on 375 square metre blocks of land. A mature premium market like Sydney will expand their product range into the bigger stuff. The trouble is somehow getting a little bit more product diversity in the market, full stop.
Kath?
Yeah, look, I'd agree, that kind of northeast corridor, there's lots of activity happening around there, and with the kind of some of the infrastructure projects that will come online in the next couple of years, that would be kind of quite an important area. In terms of products, look, you know, during pre-COVID, the government had their medium density targets, which they talked about a lot. That kind of product has fallen out of favour during COVID. I don't know, I think if WA can crack the code on attracting more international students here and more international migrants generally, that we might see a kind of resurgence in that type of product, and we certainly need to in terms of when we look at our urban planning in Perth, so certainly Perth and Peel.
Would certainly agree with North East Corridor as price growth. It's a shortage of supply in that corridor, and it's really going to start putting some pressure on price. Volume growth, North West Corridor would totally agree. The infrastructure and maturity of that market and product diversity is really coming through in the North West Corridor now. So North West will probably be the biggest pickup in volume. In terms of the apartment market, we're going to see a really interesting apartment market where it's going to be very focused on if you've got a riverfront address or views, or you've got inner city address, then it's going to work. If you don't have those factors, it's simply not going to work in this market. And much as the government want to know about infill, reality is with the new construction costs, suburban apartment development is going to disappear to a pretty big extent over the next 3 years.